When people talk about the greatest engines ever built, the conversation usually starts with horsepower numbers, exotic materials, or racing pedigree. But the engine that earned more trust than any other didn't win because it was the fastest, the smartest, or the most advanced. It won because it never left people stranded. The Chevy 350 wasn't an engine you bragged about at car shows. It didn't need defending on forums. It didn't require special knowledge to understand. While supercars aged into collectibles and experimental engines faded into cautionary tales, this unglamorous small block V8 stayed exactly where it mattered most: under hoods, in driveways, and on job sites, quietly doing its job year after year. In a world obsessed with performance peaks, the 350 built its reputation in the valleys, on cold mornings, under heavy loads, after missed oil changes, and in vehicles that simply had to start. Farmers trusted it, mechanics trusted it, fleet managers trusted it. And that trust didn't come from marketing or mythology, it came from repetition. The same outcome over and over again. That raises the real question this story is built around. How did an engine so ordinary on paper become the most trusted engine ever made? What choices, intentional or accidental, turned a simple small block into a mechanical constant across decades of change? This isn't a story about dominance through power. It's a story about survival through dependability. About why, long after trends passed and technology moved on, the Chevy 350, born inside Chevrolet's most pragmatic era, refused to disappear, and why so many people still measure every engine against it, whether they realize it or not. The Chevy 350 didn't arrive as a headline engine. It entered the market during one of the loudest, most aggressive periods in automotive history, when manufacturers were locked in open horsepower wars, and engineers were encouraged to chase extremes. Bigger numbers sold cars, and bold claims sold brands. In that environment, restraint looked like weakness. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, performance divisions were experimenting constantly. Compression ratios climbed, displacement ballooned, and engines became increasingly specialized. Many were brilliant on paper and fragile in reality. Against that backdrop, the 350 was simply the next step in a philosophy that already existed. It wasn't designed to shock competitors or redefine performance benchmarks. It was designed to work. That decision mattered. While other engines were tuned tightly for specific goals, the 350 carried generous tolerances and a layout that prioritized balance over bravado. It didn't push materials to their limits, and it didn't depend on perfect conditions to survive. At launch, that made it seem unremarkable, even conservative. But that conservatism would become its defining strength. The real conflict begins here, even if no one recognized it at the time. The industry was rewarding engineering ego, while real drivers rewarded reliability. One path led to short-lived legends. The other quietly built trust. The 350 never tried to be exotic, rare, or cutting edge. It avoided complexity not because engineers lacked ambition, but because they understood something deeper. Most engines don't fail at the limit, they fail in the middle of everyday life. In an era obsessed with winning, the Chevy 350 chose endurance. That choice didn't make headlines, but it laid the groundwork for something powerful. It laid the groundwork for dominance quietly. The reputation of the Chevy 350 wasn't built in advertisements or spec sheets. It was built in repetition. The same engine starting in different vehicles, under different conditions, with different owners, and producing the same outcome. It worked. That consistency is what turned a good engine into a trusted one. The 350 didn't belong to a single category. It powered pickups that spent their lives overloaded, sedans that saw nothing but short trips, muscle cars driven hard, and fleet vehicles expected to run every day without excuses. It tolerated heat, cold, neglect, and modification with an indifference that felt almost unnatural. Where other engines demanded ideal conditions, the 350 adapted. Mechanics noticed first. They saw engines come in abused, mismatched, and worn, yet still recoverable. Parts were interchangeable, repairs were predictable, failure rarely arrived without warning. Over time, working on a 350 stopped feeling like problem-solving and started feeling like routine. That reliability turned into confidence, and confidence turned into recommendation. Racers learned the same lesson from a different angle. The engine responded to tuning without becoming fragile. It accepted upgrades without punishing mistakes. For many builders, it became the default choice, not because it was unbeatable, but because it was forgiving. Owners didn't need to understand any of this to feel it. They experienced an engine that started when it should, survived when it shouldn't, and kept going long after expectations ran out. Trust spread quietly, passed from mechanic to customer, from fleet manager to replacement order, from one generation to the next. By the time Chevrolet realized what it had created, the 350 no longer needed promotion. It had already said yes to everything people asked of it. And that pattern, repeated millions of times, quietly transformed an ordinary small block into a default answer whenever reliability mattered more than reputation or raw performance for generations of drivers worldwide. Simplicity was never an accident in the Chevy 350. It was a deliberate choice that shaped everything else. The engine was designed around castings that favored consistency over cleverness, tolerances that allowed parts to live long lives, and layouts that made sense the first time you saw them. Nothing depended on precision electronics or fragile edge cases. If something wore out, it could be replaced. If something broke, it could be fixed. That mattered more than peak output ever could. An engine that people understand becomes an engine they trust. The 350 rewarded basic competence instead of punishing it. You didn't need factory tools or proprietary knowledge to keep it alive. Parts were cheap, plentiful, and interchangeable, which meant downtime stayed low and confidence stayed high. Over time, that accessibility created a feedback loop. The easier it was to repair, the more people used it, and the more support infrastructure grew around it. Under stress, simplicity became protection. Heat, vibration, and imperfect maintenance exposed weaknesses in complex designs. But the 350 absorbed abuse without cascading failure. Problems arrived slowly and predictably, giving owners time to respond instead of leaving them stranded. That predictability was the foundation of emotional trust. The engine stopped feeling like a black box and started feeling like a system people could control. That sense of control is powerful. It turns ownership into participation. It turns maintenance into confidence. And it turns basic into a strategy rather than a limitation. This is why simplicity outlasts sophistication. Complexity can win headlines, but simplicity wins loyalty. In the case of the 350, it became the quiet weapon that allowed an ordinary small block, born inside Chevrolet's pragmatic engineering mindset, to endure long after smarter engines came and went. The Chevy 350 didn't become legendary because of a single race win or a marketing slogan. It crossed that line when enough extreme stories began to overlap that denial stopped making sense. High-mileage trucks still running original blocks. Weekend race cars surviving seasons of abuse. Engine swaps that worked the first time in chassis never meant to accept them. Individually, these stories were impressive. Together, they formed a pattern. Racing accelerated that transformation. The 350 wasn't always the most exotic option, but it was the one that finished. Builders learned they could push it hard, tear it down, and bring it back without discovering hidden weaknesses. The engine didn't resent being modified. It tolerated experimentation and rewarded consistency. Wins mattered less than survivability, and the 350 delivered both often enough to earn permanent respect. Outside the track, mythology grew faster. Stories of engines crossing 300,000 miles weren't treated as miracles. They were treated as normal outcomes. Junkyard pulls came back to life. Neglected work trucks kept running with minimal attention. Each success made the next one easier to believe. Trust stopped being theoretical and became assumed. At some point, the conversation changed. Instead of asking whether the 350 was reliable, people began using it as a reference point. Other engines weren't simply good or bad, they were compared to it. As reliable as a 350 became a compliment. Anything less felt like compromise. That shift marked the moment it became unkillable. Not because it never failed, but because failure no longer defined it. The reputation was too large, too distributed, and too earned to undo. Long after production slowed, demand stayed constant. Long after technology advanced, expectations didn't. By then, Chevrolet didn't control the legacy anymore. The people using the engine did. And they had already decided that nothing else would ever fully replace what the 350 represented. That realization cemented its status as the trusted benchmark engine ever. The Chevy 350 didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because the world around it changed faster than its philosophy ever intended to. By the late 20th century, success was no longer measured by longevity or mechanical forgiveness. It was measured by emissions targets, efficiency curves, and computer-controlled precision. Regulations tightened. Fuel economy standards rose. Engines were no longer judged primarily by how long they lasted, but by how cleanly and efficiently they performed in controlled tests. The qualities that made the 350 trusted, generous tolerances, mechanical simplicity, and analog resilience, became liabilities in an era that rewarded tight control and electronic oversight. The industry shifted toward complexity not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Sensors replaced intuition. Software replaced mechanical margin. Engines became smarter, cleaner, and more efficient, but also more fragile outside their intended operating window. Progress demanded compromise, and durability was no longer the top priority. This wasn't a failure of engineering, it was a change in values. The 350 still excelled at what it was built to do, but the environment stopped rewarding those strengths. Trust became harder to measure than emissions output. Reliability became secondary to compliance. That's what makes the engine's decline feel tragic rather than deserved. It didn't lose relevance because it fell behind technologically. It lost relevance because the definition of success moved somewhere it was never designed to follow. Even as production ended, the trust remained. Owners kept them running. Builders kept choosing them. The engine outlived its relevance because it outlived the assumptions it was born under. In that sense, the world didn't reject the 350. It simply moved on. And in doing so, it quietly left behind a philosophy that Chevrolet had once perfected, but no longer had room to protect. The legacy of the Chevy 350 isn't found in museums or performance charts. It lives in expectations. Long after production ended, the engine continued to define what people believed an engine should be. Not perfect, not revolutionary, just dependable, understandable, and honest in its behavior. That kind of trust is rare in modern engineering. Today's machines are cleaner, faster, and smarter, but they often ask for faith rather than confidence. They work brilliantly until they don't. The 350 offered something different. It gave owners a sense of control, a feeling that problems could be anticipated, managed, and solved. Reliability wasn't an outcome, it was a relationship. This is why the 350 still functions as a benchmark even in its absence. When people praise a modern engine, they don't compare it to the best technology available. They compare it to the 350. They ask whether it will last, whether it will forgive mistakes, whether it will still be running when it shouldn't be. That comparison says everything. The engine's influence endures not because it dominated, but because it earned loyalty. It represented an era when engineering prioritized trust over optimization and longevity over novelty. That philosophy shaped generations of expectations, even as the industry moved away from it. In the end, the Chevy 350 isn't remembered as a product from Chevrolet's past. It's remembered as a standard the future quietly struggles to match. And that invites a final question worth sitting with. In the race toward progress, what did we gain? And what did we leave behind?